This is Still Enrolled.
And welcome on into the latest edition of Still Enrolled, a Big Ten football podcast. As always, Ryan Hickey, Brian Tripp with you here for, yes, it is indeed a big Week 10 in the Big Ten, highlighted, of course, by Penn State-Ohio State, top 5 matchup commencing in Happy Valley. Tripp will break down a lot of that game. We have a really special guest joining us, the last Penn State linebacker to beat Ohio State, to win a Big Ten championship. Jason Cabinda will hop on the pod here, give us his perspective of this game and so far Penn State's season. If you missed it, don't worry, Ohio State fans. This is not a slanted podcast towards one team. We got you covered. Joshua Perry joined us for a bonus episode on Wednesday. Go find that wherever you do get your podcasts and on YouTube. Still Enrolled. Joshua Tripp was amazing. He was tremendous. Awesome perspective.
I absolutely think he is. I don't know if I can still call him a rising star as an analyst in this industry, because I guess if you're on NBC's primetime football coverage, you truly have arrived. But his ability, I think, to break down what the game means, big picture, but also dive into the weeds with some of the matchups of this game. And there's so many different elements that we'll get into again today on the podcast, and we get into that with Jason. But I just think he is so good. And he talks, you can tell that he's had that TV experience now, because we like to ramble on and on and on this podcast. And Josh was like, hey, I got 15 seconds to make this point. I got to be concise and get to my point. And he is so good. I think now Jason's going to give him a run for his money, but I think my favorite guest that we've had to this point.
Both were tremendous. So again, check that out. YouTube, wherever you get your pods. Joshua has his own separate podcast, 20 Minutes. Buckeye fans, go check it out. Tremendous. Not just on this game, not just on the season, but also going down memory lane as well for the 2014 national title team. Gave us some tremendous perspective on that team as well. Like you said, Jason will join us in this episode. So a little bit later on, he'll hop on and preview that game from the Penn State perspective. Of course, we got Week 10 picks as well, Tripp, because, well, yes, Penn State, Ohio State, right, is the marquee matchup, is the game we'll talk about a lot, and a lot of people have circled on the calendar. We got some good ones here in the Big Ten as well around the conference.
One thing that sticks out to me is how much West Coast teams in the Big Ten, the new Big Ten, USC, UCLA, and by the way, Washington, they have struggled when they've had to fly not only across country, but just out of the Pacific time zone. So you have Oregon, 2 touchdown favorites. Can you believe that? Top-ranked Oregon at Michigan. No one's really talking about it. Everyone just wants to talk about Ohio State, Penn State this week. But Oregon at Michigan, Minnesota at Illinois. Minnesota favored on the road in Champaign. Right now, dare I say it, the 5th best team in the Big Ten. Indiana, 13th ranked team in the country, at Michigan State, Wisconsin at Iowa, USC at Washington. So maybe not games that nationally, unless something crazy happens in East Lansing, games that nationally are going to get a ton of attention. But I think when you look at, parity in the Big Ten this year and teams that are fairly evenly matched, there's a lot of games where, and Vegas always knows, a lot of games with really tight spreads this week in the Big Ten. And I think some really intriguing matchups that we'll get a chance to talk about outside of the big game 4-3 Ohio State at Penn State.
We got some quarterback changes here. We get, there's some really fascinating matchups to dive into. We'll do that here in a little bit. But what's crazy, Tripp, is we're recording this on Thursday. Number one, happy Halloween for you. I mean, I don't know about you. It's 80 degrees here in New York City. It does not feel like fall. It does not feel like Halloween. I see you at least dressed to the occasion here. You going with like an M&M look? What do we got here going on?
I was dressing like Josh Pate today.
Oh, I thought that was every day for you.
Yeah. Hey, yeah.
Bald head and big muscles.
Well, I appreciate that. What were you growing up for Halloween? What was the best Ryan Hickey Halloween costume?
Oh, I don't know about best. I had some pretty crappy ones. I mean, generic, a lot of athletes, but when I was younger, Spider-Man was one. I was a SWAT team member one year and I had handcuffs. I remember that.
Did you ever go as a Power? Yeah, I was gonna say everyone was a Power Ranger, right?
What color?
Green. Green was my favorite. Oh. Green's my favorite color. It always had to be green. Like when I watched Mr. Rogers growing up, I would get bothered when he went into the closet and pulled out any color sweater besides green. And that would upset me for the rest of the Mr. Rogers episode.
This is going to look bad on my Mr. Rogers memory here. I thought he only wore red. He had
No,
different
he
color
had-
sweaters?
Yes, different color sweaters every day.
Wow.
Fred.
I only remember him in the red.
No, Fred had a versatile wardrobe.
Good for Fred. And took off the sneakers, put the slippers on. Yeah, good for Fred. But whatever reason, I love blue, but red is my favorite Power Ranger. I can't explain it. At least you stuck to the green.
Yeah, I also was Barney one year. I remember my mom dressing me up as a pumpkin. My brother went as Humpty Dumpty one, and he was a little bit chubby as a kid, so it was actually pretty funny. And then obviously we were all athletes, right? I was an Eagles player. I think I was a Flyers hockey player at one point. But everyone dressed up as an athlete at some point.
I think I was a Notre Dame football player for like 5 years in a row. So I feel you. You never went as Mr. Clean in your later days? You're kind of giving that it's a compliment. You got big muscles, Mr. Everyone loves Mr. Clean.
No, I even during like, I'm not a huge Halloween person. Obviously, as a kid, you love trick or treating, you love the candy. But that phase stopped for me in middle school, and then even in college, where like Halloween's up there as like the pinnacle of your college experience. I never really had a costume even in college. I enjoyed Halloween, don't get me wrong, but I never really had a costume.
This says more about me. Halloween always stressed me out because it's like I never knew what to do in terms of like, do you go all out and have like get the face, like you just go dive into a costume and just go all out, or do you play a casual and Mr. Cool, I just got like whatever, you wear a hat and say you're a cowboy or whatever. Like I never knew the balance, and so it stressed me out. I said I hate it, and so Halloween's not one of my favorites. I'll be honest.
Where would you rank Halloween in terms of time spent on a college campus? Like, was Halloween for some people that's their favorite weekend, and they go all out? Do you remember Halloween when you were in college?
Yeah, and I never went all out. I hated Halloween, to be honest. Because again, it's just like the stress of just like, do you go all out? Do you look like? I was too self-conscious.
Yeah.
So I hated it. I couldn't wait for the weekend to pass. The worst is when it's like the middle of the week and you'd have both weekends to celebrate. People have Halloween parties on the Saturday before, the Saturday after. It's like, please, enough. I don't want to do this. Just get me past Halloween, move on. It is, not to be a curmudgeon, it is one of my least favorite holidays.
I think most of our audience knows I live in State College. So I was on Penn State's campus last night working a volleyball match at Rec Hall. And I'm leaving, and this is Wednesday of Halloween week. And I'm leaving, and I saw Mario and Luigi running down the street.
That's good.
Like, off they went on Wednesday of Halloween week. Like, it's going to be a crazy weekend here. It is going to be a crazy weekend. And it's hard to believe we're already flipping the calendar to November. November 1st is tomorrow. Big month. Best month.
Pod. Week one was just last week. And here we are in the stretch run. Unbelievable.
Saying that, it doesn't feel like that long ago. But the Big Ten preseason media poll, I was fascinated. I had to look back this week, and Ohio State was number 1, Oregon was number 2, Penn State number 3. So I think everyone knew those would be the top 3 teams in the league. Did you know Indiana was 17th in the Big Ten preseason media poll? I just thought, as we flip to November, and it's hard to believe we've been doing this podcast for 3 months now already, but as we flip to November, I wanted to take a look back, and for the most part, for me, there aren't that many teams that fall outside of where you thought or the media thought they would be. But to look back and see Ohio State, Oregon, Penn State, 1, 2, 3, but Indiana 17th in that poll, it's fascinating to see where we've come over 2.5 months.
And obviously, right, Indiana, the biggest surprise in the conference, arguably the biggest surprise in the country, right? We've discussed that a ton. But even to your point, look at the poll. How about at 13, Illinois? That's a team that we could talk about here. And even Minnesota at 12, I think right now they're playing for that 5th best spot or 5th best place in the Big Ten this weekend. I mean, we're talking about the 12th and 13th ranked teams in the preseason where nobody thought either of these teams would be competitive. It was just bowl eligibility, right? It was probably the goal. You get a 6 wins, massive success. And here you are talking about a big game that could get you on the path to 8 wins, maybe for a really successful season.
Do you think in the Big Ten, is it fair to say the season has played out as expected because of what's happened at the top? And it looks like a conference right now that's going to get 3 or 4 teams into the college football playoff. And ultimately, that's what your conference, any conference, the Big Ten, SEC, ACC, that's what you're going to be measured on, is how many teams reach the college football playoff and what type of success do they have in the postseason. Do you think I'm not sure if the right way to phrase it is, has it played out as expected? Do you think it's been a successful season for the Big Ten, the first year of this new Big Ten with 18 teams adding the 4 teams from the West Coast?
I would say 100%. Right? Like, I think it's easy to say that because there's really not that many non-competitive teams for the most part.
Yeah.
Like, even like you're seeing UCLA now, they pushed Penn State in the close game earlier in October. They just beat Rutgers. Again, not a great win, but like for the most part, there are no doormats. And at least if there are no weekly doormats here, to where any team, any given week can truly push you, wake you up, and give you a scare. I think that's the sign of a healthy conference. 1 through 18, it's not top heavy at the top where, you have 3 teams in the top 5, but other than that, the rest of the conference stinks. Illinois is still ranked. Like, even USC, like, the record's not pretty, but that's a team that I think would scare a lot of people in the country. They had to play them this upcoming week. I think the conference has been very healthy because it has been, I think, very competitive. So when you talk like success, has it been a successful season in this new expanded Big Ten? I would say so far through 2 months, absolutely. How about you?
I agree with that. And I think for the same reason that, you can have a Penn State, a top 5 team, go on the road to Wisconsin, and because of the environment, whatever you want to make of it, but because of the environment, because going on the road to a Big Ten to face there's something about going on the road and facing a Big Ten team, smash mouth, power football. And I know the conference has evolved and it's not necessarily that anymore, but you still get that identity to it. I think that is what makes it healthy and successful. Now, I think you see the long-term potential of the league as well, where Ohio State, Oregon, and Penn State are rolling right now. The expectation is Michigan, USC, maybe a Washington, Nebraska. Like, the expectation is for that top to be a little bit deeper. I would say Indiana obviously has made a big impact in where they've gone this year under Curt Cignetti, and it remains to be seen if there's staying power there for Indiana. So I think the top is only going to get better and expand beyond the 3 teams that are there right now in the Big Ten. But overall, the overall depth, the competitiveness week in, week out, and to your point, I think if you're a Penn State fan right now, and the way Minnesota's playing, when you have to go to Minnesota in a couple of weeks, you're saying, okay, that's a game. That's a game. Now, is it a little bit different and we saw this last week, like Illinois at Oregon, do you really feel like one of those mid-tier teams can go on the road and win in Columbus, Eugene, Happy Valley, or maybe even Bloomington right now? And I think that answer is no. But when a team has to go on the road in the league, the way, and I'm going to go back to the same example because they played tight games, Penn State had to go to USC. That's the sign of a healthy league where a team that right now is at the bottom of your standings in the conference is going to put up that type of fight. Minnesota had to win at the wire at UCLA. Nebraska pushed Ohio State last weekend, and that was in Columbus. That, to your point, I think that's the sign of a healthy league. I think it's been really successful, but I think there's still the ability. I think the next step then is to have more teams, your USCs, Michigans, Washingtons. Is it Nebraska with Matt Rule? Is it Jed Fish getting Washington back there? Is it Luke Fickell taking a step in Madison? Is elevating some of those teams where your upper echelon tier, kind of the way the SEC is right now, right? And they beat up on each other, where that upper echelon tier has a little bit more of an expanded top. Instead of top 3, top 4, it's probably like a top 6 in an 18-team league.
What about predictability so far in the Big Ten? Through 2 months as we go in the home stretch here in November, has this season played out the way you anticipated for the most part?
I just think you have to say yes with Ohio State, Oregon, and Penn State right now shaping up to be college football playoff teams. Even if Ohio State falls in Happy Valley this weekend, if Ohio State beats Indiana, they're in the playoff. If Penn State falls to Ohio State this weekend, they're still they're in the driver's seat for the playoff. Oregon's in the driver's seat to make the playoff. I think the expectation was to have 3 teams that were truly college football playoff contenders and contenders to make a deep run in there. I think the big surprise, like it's no surprise that we're saying this, is that Indiana is as good as they have been. And I think because they went from being a preseason afterthought, can they get 3-4, like a bowl game, to your point, would have been an incredible success strictly because of how good Indiana has been. And because I would say Michigan and USC have been a little bit more disappointing than you would have thought. I don't know that it's played out as I thought. I think there's some that has and some that hasn't. Like, I think it's a really tough question to answer a yes or no to, because of, yes, ultimately the 3 teams you thought were going to be there are there as we flip the calendar to November. But Indiana, I mean, it is such a big story, and how they've done it and how good they look and how dominant. That's why I can't give a yes or no to that question.
I'm going to say, like, I don't think this season has gone as I anticipated. Now, a little bit is marginal here, right? But like, if we take the preseason poll, which is a prediction of how people think the season will go, also a little bit of
the media,
teams are there, right?
By the media,
right? Yeah, by the media. Ohio State 1, Oregon 2, Penn State 3. Those are the 3 best teams in the conference, right? Like, when you kind of dive deep, Ohio State to this point has looked worse than I anticipated. Honestly, I did not expect them to be sitting here November 2nd, possibly getting a second loss.
I mean, they lost, but you had to anticipate that coming into the year with their 2 toughest games being on the road. And like, that Oregon game's a 1-point game. Ohio State, if that pass interference call doesn't go against them, if they get a timeout in, if they get one break, that's a 1 play. I mean, that's how slim the margin is in sports, but particularly college football, because of 1 play right now. We're saying, Ohio's. If that result flips, the narrative of Ohio State changes, even though, like, for me, the Ohio State thing right now is how they looked against Nebraska is more condemning of where they're at than the 1-point loss at Oregon. Like, the 1-point loss at Oregon, it is what it is. It goes in your record. Instead of them being number 1, they're number 4 this week, and they have a loss on their resume. A second loss isn't keeping them out of the college football playoff. But how they looked against Nebraska and the offensive, Will Howard not using him in the run game, the struggles they have now on the offensive line. I was listening to Reese Davis. He was talking about, and he got some stat. When Josh Simmons plays, they're averaging 4 yards per carry before contact. When Josh Simmons does not play, they're averaging 1 yard per carry before contact. Like, the numbers are straight. And then the overall yards, the yards per carry, the amount, 37% of the plays in which Josh Simmons does not play go for 0 or negative yards. When Josh Simmons is in, I think the number's 12% or 11%. Like Reese Davis shared that on social media last night. It is straight. So I think it's more how they looked than that 1-point loss at Oregon. That's really defining what we think about Ohio State going into the matchup with Penn State this weekend.
Agreed. And maybe maybe this is just recency bias of how they looked last against Nebraska. But like, the Oregon game aside, I never anticipated them to look that vulnerable against a team in Nebraska that's not exactly been blowing everybody out and playing good football. And I thought Ohio, look, I know you can't predict injuries. And like you said, Josh Simmons is a major impactful player for Ohio State. But with that said, I assumed and anticipated Ohio State would not be 1 injury away from having their season almost derailed. Like, that's a 2, like, all the talent they accumulated. They are so good that 1 injury should not derail your season. We talked to Joshua Perry. They lost 2 quarterbacks and still won a national title. Like, and they lost the most important position 2 different times. So it's like they did not allow 1 injury or multiple injuries to derail their season. I thought Ohio State, look, maybe they can win on Saturday, and maybe they do. And all of a sudden I'm eating crow, and they're back right there near the top. But right now you look at, they look more vulnerable in general than I thought at this point in the season. Then you look at, like, behind Penn State at 3, right? Michigan 4, they've been a disaster. Iowa 5 has been very disappointing. USC 6, obviously can't close out a game. Wisconsin 7. I know they lost their quarterbacks. So that has something to do with it. But a little bit more, I would say, disappointing than maybe you anticipate. That to be a little bit more competitive. Nebraska at 8 feels about that range, right? It's been a roller coaster, but I think they kind of maybe sit maybe a little bit, further back in the standings than 8. But they've been right there. Rutgers has been more disappointing than we thought at 9. Washington at 10 feels right about right. Average team. Yeah. And so far how they played. Maryland and maybe even more disappointing.
I was gonna say Washington, Maryland, probably a little disappointing. Minnesota was picked 12th. They're probably playing better than that now. But how they started was, they should have beaten North Carolina. That was disappointing for them. Maybe there is more disappointing than good in the Big Ten.
And you look at the tail end, right? Illinois we talked about, but Northwestern, UCLA, Purdue, they feel like they are where they, that season has gone as we anticipated. I would even say Michigan State trip. They were picked to be 16th. I know their record's not great. I think they've been better and more competitive than the third worst team they were picked to be before the season. Like, I think it has been some good, some bad, but I feel like out of those 18 teams, there are about like 5 teams. And when you look at the preseason poll to where we are now, that I feel like kind of sit and be like, okay, yeah, how we thought their season would go is how it's actually gone so far.
That's interesting. And it might be the landscape of college football today with the portal. And you know what? I'm not going to say I think it is. That's why it's hard to really have a pulse on a conference going into a year because of all the changes, players leaving for the NFL. Do you have a player for 3 years? And this will be the last of the COVID years, but do you have a player for 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, 6 years? How does a portal impact 7 years in some cases? Yeah, 7 years in some cases. How does the portal impact it? How does NIL impact it? Like, I think it's harder to get a pulse on college football right now because of the ever-changing nature of the sport and all the dynamics that are at play.
And even in the case of Minnesota, right? Not only can you maybe try to project how the transfer portal impacts, but maybe they get off to slower starts than think because they're trying to work it out. Where Max Brosberg now looks like a totally different quarterback than he did week 1, where, I mean, you watch that North Carolina game, it's, this is not very good. And now he's playing a lot better.
I think that's something we talked about with Oregon, right? The assumption that Dylan Gabriel, as great of a quarterback as and obviously he's a tremendous quarterback, but what they lost center position on the offensive line, some of the skill positions players changed. The assumption that you can just plug and play like you're playing a video game, you still have to get chemistry, cohesion, learn the playbook. Look where Oregon is now, and they were able to survive without a defeat because they are so good, even though they were pushed by Idaho. They were pushed by Boise State, but that's a little bit more understandable. But you can't just plug and play. Why does it work for Indiana? Because so many of those guys played together before under Curt Cignetti. That's why it worked for them. And that is really hard to project at what point it will click when you have that much change. Because I still think the best way to build a roster is you build it through a foundation, through recruiting. You're able to hopefully keep, and this is the weird dynamic about college football now, is you have to recruit your own players just as much as you're recruiting other players to come and join your program. Keep players satisfied, give them reps, coddle them. You got to coddle them enough. You keep them invested in your program. And if you can get guys who are 2, 3-year guys in your program and you put them in your lineup, and that's the foundation. Then you build, hey, we got a 4 or 5-star kid. He's ready to play right away. All right, we're gonna put him on the field. Okay, and then 1 or 2 transfer players to fill spots. That's ultimately going to lead to the best long-term success still for your program. Now, when you have a national championship caliber roster, the way Oregon does, the way Ohio State does, and you feel like you can upgrade the quarterback position, go and do it. Do it. But you can't. I don't think it's sustainable to have the amount of turnover every single year and be consistently successral in this era of college football.
Look at Florida State, for example, right? Undefeated in the regular season last year. Yeah, 1 win this year. Mike Norvell's lived in the transfer portal, and when it works, it works. When it doesn't, boy, does it flame out. And like you said, Indiana's an example, right, of a team that went heavy in the transfer portal in Curt Cignetti's first year. How are you going to now, like you said, develop, get that recruiting base in moving forward, get sustainability? Interesting to watch, but it's the world of college football now in 2024 and beyond.
Yeah, let's stop beating around the bush, though, right? This is a huge weekend, a big weekend in the Big Ten. Number 4, Ohio State at number 3, Penn State. We're going to dive into this game, but let's bring in our guest, Jason Cabinda, this week, former Penn State linebacker, fullback for the Detroit Lions. And he's lived some of these issues that modern college football, modern athletes have to deal with. And he's transitioned now from player to analyst, player to golfer, as most retired people do. But he's lived some of these issues. So our conversation with Jason, we're going to get into the game, but he's lived some of these issues as well, including how you deal with social media today. So let's bring in our guest, Jason Cabinda, here on the Still Enrolled podcast. Jason Cabinda, former Penn State linebacker, NFL fullback, Detroit Lions, joining us. And Jason's someone, Ryan, that I've gotten to know really well the last couple of years. And even during his playing days, he always took an interest in going into the other side, the media side of things. And he was on some of our programs at Penn State the last few years. So he's transitioned this year to being a part of our Penn State football pregame show, among other things. And I think he played 36 holes of golf earlier today. He has a lot of time for his number one hobby now. But Jason, we appreciate you hopping on the podcast.
Just an absolute maniac nowadays on the golf course, man.
What did you shoot and where'd you play?
I shot a 89 on my second round and a 93 on my first, so I improved.
Yeah. That's not bad. That's not bad.
Solid. If I hit in the 80s, I'm happy.
Yeah. Who's your ideal foursome to play with?
Ooh, my ideal out of Penn State guys.
Yeah.
It'll probably be the biggest trash talker. It'll probably be Saquon, number one. He talks a lot of trash on the golf course. Then it'll be Amani or Warrior. And the last guy is going to be a fun guy. He's not going to shoot well. Wouldn't want him as your scramble partner. Bring the juice and energy. That's a little Mark Allen.
Now, did you see that Saquon, did you get to talk to him that he played with President Obama?
Oh, did he? No, I actually don't think he told me.
Yeah, he got to play with President Obama at Marion maybe yesterday, on Tuesday this week.
Oh, that's pretty cool.
Yeah. The foursome was Jalen Hurts, the Eagles owner, Jeff Lurie, President Obama, and Saquon. That's a foursome.
Not bad.
That is pretty fire. Can't lie.
Hey, what was it during your playing days that always intrigued you about coming over to the dark side afterwards and doing the media and staying involved in football, covering it that way?
Good question. I actually get this a decent amount. I just feel like as a player, man, the media, and I know in this new social media age and the age that we live in, man, it's hard to get away from. You try to shut it down, whether it's Twitter, Instagram, whatever it is. But I started to feel like during college that, and even during the NFL, my career, that the media wasn't being done the right way. I felt like there was a way to criticize the players without making things personal. And I felt too many times when I'd watch these shows, whether it's Stephen A., Skip Bayless, First Take, whatever it is, that there were too many personal attacks on players. And I just felt like there was a better way to do the job while, just being more professional, honestly, I guess is the way to put it. My inspiration really comes from wanting to do the job the right way, wanted to cover players, because there's so much positivity, man. There's so many things that guys are doing on the field, off the field, that I feel like I would rather crowd the space, the media space, with positive things what guys are doing than constantly nitpicking to find the negative stuff that I feel like the media has become nowadays is just too negative.
I think when you were playing collegiately, social media obviously was a tool, but it was still emerging into really just the 24/7 nonstop constant noise that it became during your NFL career and is today. As a player, in your college days and in your pro career, did you look at social media? How do guys handle that in the locker room? And what would your advice be to a college player today dealing with everything that they have on their plate?
Yeah, to be honest, early in my career, I was a guy. I've always been a big Twitter guy. So I was always a guy who was on Twitter a lot. And Twitter has become quite the negative machine. And I think at a certain point in time, I think it was my sophomore year after my Temple game, I had a really bad game. It's probably my worst game of my college career. I just remember reading some of the stuff people were saying, just like, man, after that experience and the way it weighed down on me, and I thought about it too much, and it started to mess with my motivations and the whys of why I was doing things, which it never should. I don't think as a football player, as anybody who's pursuing a passion, your why should never change. And I felt like my why was starting to be directed towards negative, towards just negative reasons, negative narratives. I was trying to prove people wrong instead of proving the people who support me right and things of that nature. So I just had to put it down, and really, really just get off of it altogether. And I think for guys who are young now and who are playing now at this age, man, and with this age of social media, I think it's best to stay off it altogether. I think you're just better off.
Speaking of change, Jason, I'm curious because there's so much change in current college football with NIL, with the transfer portal, now the 12-team playoff. But what about on the field? We know about change surrounding the game, but as a player now, as an analyst, you see the game obviously firsthand. Do you notice anything different from when you played to now, kind of the college football game as it is in 2024?
Yeah, I would just say the biggest change is honestly the way it's being officiated. I really did not like the discourse around the targeting rule. I just think that because of the way football looks at certain times, it can be brutal and things, and we're trying to limit the brutal hits. But at the end of the day, the brutality of the sport, there's beauty in it. And I say that a lot. And I truly feel like the targeting rule is just too hard of a rule to officiate correctly all of the time and does more damage than good at the end of the day. We grew up watching the Sean Taylors, the Brian Dawkins, the big hits. We love that. That's what we grew up on. That's what we idolized growing up as players. That's how we were taught to play the game. And for there to be this sudden change in the way we want the game played, when there's fundamentals, ways of playing that we have been taught by our coaches all the way from Pop Warner through high school, through college, to think that we're just going to be able to suddenly change, it just doesn't make sense. And I honestly think that it has negative externalities from a safety standpoint, because if you're teaching players to slow down in a game in which you need to make decisions at a split second's notice, all you're doing is putting guys in harm's way because they're being hesitant out there. And football is not the type of sport that you can play hesitantly.
I'm glad you brought that up. I hate the targeting rule, and really it has to do with the ejection part. I think it's such a harsh penalty. I get why the rule is there because you want to at least prevent players from using their head, right? But to your point, how we see it on TV, you see the slow down replays and the head, the officials up, there's a head drop. You hear the indicators all the time about this rule. But from a player perspective, Jason, how difficult is it, like you said, in those split moments there, to make the right tackle, if you will, and not have a head-to-head collision, and not only get yourself ejected from the rest of that game, but depending on if it's the second half or not, you'd be out the first half of next game. It's a massive consequence. The referees, I feel, explain it like they make it seem like it's very easy to not commit targeting. From your perspective as a linebacker, is that true?
No, it's not an easy thing. And to be honest, I think the referees are officiating in more of a way of how the hit looks than how the hit was actually delivered. And that I have an issue with. At the end of the day, if it's a 3rd and 8 and a guy catches the ball on 7 yards and 1 yard away from the first down line, are you really expecting this guy to not do everything he can to get that ball carrier on the ground? Not only that, can you raise your pad level without also lowering your head? Lower your pad level without also lowering your head? It's not possible to do that. You can't keep your head down here and try to make your shoulders go down. That's how it works. Where your shoulders go and pad level go, your head is also going to go. You see guys in the NFL, the fines are out of control. You have guys literally being fined, literally just for playing football. It's ridiculous, absolutely ridiculous. And I just think that society is making our game become soft. And that is the one thing we cannot allow happen, that I feel like we're allowing to happen currently as we speak.
Jason, we could go on and on that topic, but big game coming up, obviously. Penn State, Ohio State. You're already in Happy Valley for the game on Saturday. Take this game out of it. For you, in your career, when there was a big game on the calendar that upcoming Saturday, was there an extra motivation in practice? When did the juices start flowing? We hear the coach speak of every game's the same. Every game, you got to approach each week the same, which I get. There's a routine element to it. But as a player, how much of that is true? And when you have a 3 versus 4 matchup with a potential berth in a Big Ten championship, a playoff berth on the line, how much does it raise the stakes as a player?
I think it definitely raises it. I think as players, you want to go up against the best. So a top 5 matchup, that's what you go to a place like Penn State for, to play in these type of games and nationally televised games where the entire world or an entire country is going to be able to see your talent on display. That's why you work. That's why you put the extra hours in. So I think it is definitely extra motivational, because at the end of the day, on that type of stage, you want to be at your best. And I feel like, the guys who really, take the game to heart and take being the best to heart, make sure on those weeks especially, they're doing everything from a preparation standpoint so that they can be at their best on Saturday.
Do you ever get nervous?
Absolutely. I feel like if you don't get nervous, it means you don't care.
Interesting.
But that's what I did for me. It's so crazy you asked this question, because this was an actual process I had to go through as a player, is dealing with nervousness. And at first, I used to associate nervousness with a negative trait, and that was fear. I'm nervous because what if I don't this, or what if I miss this catch, or what if I don't make this block or make this tackle, instead of associating my nervousness with a positive trait, which is just caring for the game and caring about winning. And that's what I made my nervousness about. And that really helped flip that switch for me mentally as a player, was positively reinforcing what nervousness means to me and what that's signaling to my body. And it's not fear. It's just that I really care because I want to win and I want to be this good, et cetera, et cetera.
Did that flip come from a conversation with a coach, a sports psychologist? Like, how'd that happen?
Conversation with God, honestly. I feel like I arrived there through prayer because I knew how hard I worked, man. I worked so hard. I was so dedicated to my craft and being the best player I could be. But I found myself in times, in dire moments early in my career, where I was letting nervousness and fear really overcome my play. And I was soul searching and trying to figure a way, because I was always about, okay, maybe I just need to train harder so I can rely on my training and stuff like that. But once I made that switch emotionally, it really helped me work through nervousness throughout the rest of my career.
Really interesting. Really cool. Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Jason. You obviously hold a big place in Penn State fans' hearts, and your team in 2016 does as well. That's not only the last time Penn State won a Big Ten title game, but also the last time Penn State beat Ohio State. Before we look ahead to this match, I'm just curious, going back to that game, what do you remember most about that night, either on the field, afterwards? Like what kind of stands out now, 8 years later, from that win over Ohio State?
I mean, what that win symbolized and signified for us as a team, as a football program, for us, I believe it was getting over the hump. It was getting the monkey off of the back. So I think for me, the biggest thing that stood out to me was the belief factor during and after that game of we are who we say we are. And that's a powerful thing, man. So I think when we beat them, we were unranked. They were number 2 in the country. After we beat them, there wasn't anybody we thought we couldn't beat. We didn't walk into any stadium. We didn't walk into any game feeling like there was even a possibility that we could lose. We were that good. We felt we were that good, and we believed we were that good. And I think that belief factor is a big, big difference between good and great teams.
That's interesting, because this game, looking ahead to the Saturday, right, there's been to talk about, from Penn State's perspective, you can afford to lose it because you have no losses. So even if you go 11-1, you're still in the playoff. Even at 10-2, you're probably in the playoff, right? So this is not one of those consequential matchups where your season ends if you lose to Ohio State, like in previous 4-team playoff situations. But like what you're talking about, the confidence you get when you look at this game from Penn State's perspective, is that still why like it's a big game and not taking it maybe as lightly as, hey, we can afford to lose one?
Yeah, I think you put it perfectly. I think this game is so much bigger than the fact that, if we lose, our season's not over. I think just the fact that this game, what it can represent for Penn State moving forward for who we are and getting over the hump, getting the monkey off of our back, getting rid of the narratives of Coach Franklin can't win the big ones or Penn State chokes in the big games. I think all of that is bigger from a belief standpoint than any of the facts that, if we lose this game, it's a possibility that, we still get in the playoffs and things of that nature. Like, no, this is about making sure that Penn State is elite. That's what it's about. It's about showing that Penn State and our program is an elite program. We're a top 5 program. We're an elite program in the Big Ten. So I think it's more about proving that. It's more about putting our flag and our stake in the ground and saying, this Big Ten is ours. So I think it's bigger than all of that.
Obviously, that Ohio State game in 2016 on the blocked field goal from Marcus and Grant was the statement mark of the season. But I think any championship caliber team goes through some adversity, and there's kind of that moment when the switch flips on. And I felt like for this year's Penn State team, and it will be until January that we'll know if this is the truth or not, but I felt like for this year's team, that happened at halftime of the game at USC, and the way Drew Aller put the team on his back and Tyler Warren, and they had the huge comeback in the second half. I felt like for your 2016 team, there were the Fire Franklin chants at halftime of the Minnesota game, and Irv Charles catches the pass from Trace and takes it to the end zone, and you win it in overtime, coincidentally, with Saquon walking it off. Is that a real thing? Is that a fair assessment that championship teams at some point is how they handle that adversity, and there's a moment where all of a sudden it comes together?
Yeah, because at the end of the day, that's what football is all about, man. And that's why we say one play at a time all the time, because things happen, momentum changes, things of that nature. But it's about how do you handle adversity when it hits? You need that gut check so that you can look to the left, look to the right, see that man in his eyes, and know exactly what he's got inside of him. So when you look at games like USC, we're down 20-6 at halftime. It's woe is me. We're on the road. It's only us in here. To bring that out and to bring your guts out, to play how they played and come back and win that game in overtime the way that they did and deliver a gut punch to USC in response, that's character. In Wisconsin game, to lose our starting quarterback middle of the game, to go through injuries, and for not one person to look to the left and right and have doubt because Bo Pribula was going in that game and had to finish that game for us, that's character. So that's why I feel like this team is a championship team, because the adversity is hit, and this team has showed us that they're built to handle it.
Yeah, what impresses you about this group? Because you can look at, there's certain teams across the country. I know Texas has lost a game and Georgia's lost a game. Oregon was in some tight games early, but there's kind of that flash and like sexiness to how they play, and they're going to go through some games and just blow teams out. Penn State has been in control. I don't know that anyone ever felt like in any games they're going to lose this year, maybe the USC game, but they've been in control, but they're maybe not sexy about how they go about their wins. They get it done. They get it done in a convincing fashion. What is it about this team that, even though it may look a little bit different at times, that in your mind, this is a Penn State team that belongs where they're at in the rankings and has a legitimate shot to make a deep run in the playoffs?
Because to me, this is a team that's just steady. They're a team that doesn't look at the scoreboard. They're a team that doesn't care about what happened last play. Those are championship traits. We talk about the adversity. We talk about injuries they've gone through. There's so many narratives. I mean, there's a lot going on. Big Ten is changing, and this team just shows up and shows up. And not only that, they're built for the long run. We have a great run game. We have gritty, tough offensive linemen. We have a very capable quarterback. We have a defense that is a top 10 defense in this country, in my opinion. So the talent is there. We're playing well, or well enough, and we're playing complementary football. Like that's a winning formula. We're winning turnover battles. We're getting turnovers. We're winning the penalty battles. Like we're doing the right things. So when it comes to mentality, I remember Coach Franklin at the end of a press conference talked about, there was a reporter who asked, like, what is it about taking the next step? What do you guys have to do? And he was like, it's all the little things. It's doing the ordinary things extraordinary. It's being on time for meetings. It's being in meetings and being locked in. It's taking notes every single meeting. And that's what I love so much about Coach Franklin. Like, success is so hard to come by. You have to do so many things right. And not only do you have to do so many things right, other things outside of your control also have to line up the right way for success to happen. So Coach Franklin's mantra in general, and what I take so much about my experience about Penn State is, man, do absolutely everything that's in your power the right way, and good things will come. Sometimes it'll take some luck too, but you can make your own luck. And making your own luck comes from doing the right things the right way with the right work ethic and things of that nature. So,
speaking of making your own luck, Jason, what do you think this game on Saturday comes down to? What are you kind of looking at here as the big key?
I think if you're bringing it strictly to football, I think what happens in the trenches is what's going to decide this game. I think we're very evenly matched skill-wise and things of that nature, but it's really going to come down to the trenches. Philosophically, in the big picture, this game's going to come down to who wants it more. That's what this game is going to come down to. I don't care if Drew's playing, if Bo's playing, if this, if that. We're in Beaver. We're at home. It's going to be who wants it more. That's who's going to win this game.
You know, we talked to a guy that I know you have a lot of respect for, Joshua Perry, who works now with NBC, was with Big Ten Network. And we asked him, the same question here. as a defensive player, when you're preparing for obviously Andy Kotelnicki and James Franklin's offense, and Bo Prabula's had a role, but not a big role in the offense, Drew Aller versus preparing for Bo Prabula, and you still have Tyler Warren and Nicholas and all those other things. How much more complicated does it make it for Ohio State to prepare this week as a defensive unit, not knowing exactly what you're going to see? Are you going to see 90% Drew Aller? Or are you going to see 0% Drew Aller? How much more difficult does it make it?
Yeah, I was talking about this earlier in the week. I think the quarterback speculation really plays well into Penn State's hands, because at the end of the day, this offense operates completely different, whether Bo's at quarterback or whether Drew's at quarterback. And as a defensive coordinator, preparing for an offense like this that's already not very traditional, in the sense that the feature player in this offense and who it's built around is a tight end, which we don't normally see already. So there's a lot of intricacies to preparing for this offense. And then it's okay, if Bo's the guy this week, how much are we preparing for Bo? How much are we preparing for Drew? How much quarterback run are we going to see compared to not? What type of nuances are we going to have? If they're in the gun with the back two, are we going to have our DN crashing and tackle the dive because we think Drew's going to be in there and he's never going to pull it? Or are we going to have to tell our DNs that, hey, you got to sit this week because, hey, Bo pulling it is real? So there's a lot of things in this game. And like I said, I think the quarterback speculation plays into Penn State's favor perfectly going into this game.
What about game time, Jason? I'm curious here. A lot of Penn State fans are very upset this week, right, about the noon kickoff, not a whiteout game, not a 7:30 game. You can't tailgate as long, obviously. That's been talked about not just this week, for months, really. What about from a player perspective here? Is there a difference? Is there any sort of advantage? Is there any preference, honestly, between a 7:30 kick, a noon kick? I mean, I'm sure Beaver Stadium is going to be loud either way, right, whenever it is. But, like, does the kickoff being at noon actually impact anything in terms of the game?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is the type of game that should be a night game, no question. I mean, the Beaver Stadium is Beaver Stadium no matter what, but, man, Beaver Stadium whiteout at night is beyond special, you know, and this game, a top 5 matchup, simply deserves that atmosphere. So I'll kind of leave it at that from that standpoint. I mean, I had a lot of 12 o'clock games when I played in the league. I enjoyed waking up and playing and having the rest of the day. I like just going and getting up and going, the idea of that. And knowing that on that Friday night or that Saturday night that was my last day of preparation, and when I wake up my eyes, it's just go time. So I enjoyed that, but there definitely are nuances to having a 7:30 game, because then you're in the hotel all day and it's just a waiting game. You know, you're sick of watching film. You're just ready to play. You're trying to, manage your emotions, making sure you're not peaking too early and things of that nature. But at least 12 o'clock, you get to wake up and just release it all. So.
We obviously talked about Penn State-Ohio State 2016 and the blocked field goal that was returned for a touchdown. Is that your favorite? What was your favorite moment as a player at Penn State?
Oh, wow. Favorite moment. It's between that Ohio State game, because that game was personal for me. Coming off of an injury. I mean, dude, I was like a pit bull foaming at the mouth inside of a cage when I came out of that Ohio State game. So to come out that game and play the way I played, I was proud, and to have a role in that win, and how pivotal that win was for our season was huge, because at the end of the day, that's the confidence that game sparked and grew, that confidence that team had that led us to that Big Ten championship. And then just the Big Ten championship, that game in general, because it was just so much of the epitome of what we went through that season, being down 28-7 at halftime and things not going our way, being a second half team and coming back. I mean, there's just so much about that. And then obviously just the cherry on top, it being Penn State's first Big Ten championship outright, bringing the program back after everybody said our program would be dead and things of that nature. It was a super, super sweet moment.
You mentioned second half team there. Sorry, Ryan. You mentioned second half team there. There's kind of the notion around this year's team that they're a second half team. I think we're on the same page. Were you guys the same thing?
Yes.
You were. Okay. And Jason's thinking the same thing too. There's kind of that notion that this is a second half team this year. Is that a true thing? Can there really be a second half team? Like, what is it about it that all of a sudden halftime, to the casual fan, to maybe even the intelligent fan, it's like Jekyll and Hyde in the second half, something else happens. It's a different team out of the locker room.
Yeah, it's hard, man. We've harped on this on past shows. It's been an issue starting slow and things of that nature. It's hard to pinpoint, the whys around why that's happening and why we're coming out the second half and, being lights out in that nature. But at this point in time, I'm believing the story. This is a second half team, and honestly, I'm okay with it. And like when I look at, Coach K's offense and some of the slow starts that we've had, Coach K is a type of coordinator that builds a story throughout the game. So sometimes the haymakers – they come timely. They come at the right times. So I don't get that mad when we're not coming out just swinging, haymakers, off-rip, things of that nature, because that's the way the offense is built. The offense is built to give the defense multiple looks, see what they do, and react off this. Okay, this is going to be open. We're going to build off of this, and now it's going to be play action because this run hit and things of that nature. So I'm okay with that. Defensively, though, I feel like we have the type of talent where we should come out and be punching people in the mouth. So I do feel that, because that is also what championship defense is, and we're capable of that this year. I do think that definitely needs to improve in order for us to be the team down the road that's the last one standing.
Jason, I would just want to go back here quickly to 2017, because that, like, for how great 2016 was, obviously, right, beat Ohio State, go on the run, win the Big Ten title game. There's a lot of players come back in 2017. And I know, at least for me, like, I thought this was a national title kind of contending, maybe winning team. You look back on that year, is there a moment, did you actually, I'll put it this way, did you get that feeling? Do you feel like this was a team that truly could win the national title that year?
Yeah, I think we all felt that way going into that year. I think there was a lot of pressure on us as well going into that year because everybody felt it. Everybody was talking about it. And at one point in that season, we were number 2 in the nation. So it was there. I do feel like that pressure may have taken away from that team a little bit because I feel like that 2016 team was so fun. I felt like going to that 2017 season was a bit more business, and I feel like all the expectations that we had on us may have taken a little bit out of the fun that we had playing with each other. I will say that. I'll add that in there.
Interesting.
And at that time, Joe Moorhead was the offensive coordinator, and I'm not sure how much time you've gotten to spend with Andy Kotelnicki, but are there some similarities there between the two?
Both of those guys got a huge set of balls, man. Both those guys got a huge set of balls. That's what I'll say, man. I loved Joe Mo and our offense, man. 16, 17, bro. Like, he had our offense firing on all cylinders. He called shots. Like, he was fearless in the play calls. And I see the play calling being fearless in that same way with Coach K. And that's why I love him. He's not afraid, man. He believes in his players. And when the play calls come in, you can tell that dependability is there. You can tell that the trust is there. And that's so important as a player, man. When you have a coach that trusts in you, that believes in you, that's very, very empowering as a player. And you can tell and you can see, even in this Wisconsin game, Bo talked about how Coach K, man, when he looked him in the eyes, like, he could tell that there was no moment of disbelief. There was none of that in his eyes, man. And that's so important.
That's awesome.
Does that permeate through? That fearlessness, it permeates. You could really feel that.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. There's no question about it. Absolutely.
And you pair that with what's always been a great Penn State defense, great players over the years, LBU, and you're a big part of that. Jason, appreciate it. We'll be looking forward to the Penn State pregame show, which is 2.5 hours before every game. You can watch that on YouTube and on gopsusports.com. Jason and Christian Hackenberg host the show with yours truly, just kind of filling in as a reporter. I get to enjoy the nice weather on the sidelines. Jason, appreciate you for joining the podcast here.
Appreciate you guys.
Ryan, I've gotten to know Jason. He's become a friend, and he has a bright future in not only analyzing football, but I think his personality, his charisma, he could be like a Michael Strahan type in the media. I'm serious about that. He really could be. Before we dive into the game, we talked kind of some nuances with Jason, but big picture of this matchup, right? There's so many different directions we can go. The significance of the game in a 12-team college football playoff, does it lose any of its luster? The coaching matchup, Ryan Day and James Franklin, and I think the track records that they've had. There's so much consternation this week, great word, in Happy Valley about this game being at noon and not 3:30 or 7:30 in prime time. Where do you want to go first?
Let's talk about the kickoff time first, actually.
Yep.
I mean, it's fans, like you said, been talking about it. This is not just a week discussion. This has been months-long discussion when it all but was certain that Fox would have this game, which meant big noon kickoff.
Yeah.
I get it from the fans' perspective. I thought it was interesting to hear Jason's perspective though in the game because, like, honestly, look, obviously fans want to tailgate as long as possible. I get that, right? But if it means, I'll put it this way. I feel a little bit better about it if Jason's talking about, you know what, maybe it's easier just to wake up and go play. You don't have to overthink it and you just can kind of wake up and go. Makes you feel a little bit better about your, Penn State's chances in general of playing a sharp, crisp game here. If it is less thinking and more going, I know fans are not going to be happy about that. Obviously, the atmosphere for a whiteout under the lights is not going to be there. But I mean, Trip, you've been on the field, right, at Beaver Stadium for some of the biggest games. I've been in the stands. You've been on the field. I don't expect any different atmosphere for this game because it's at noon compared to 7. Beaver Stadium is going to be rocking. It's going to be loud. The fans are going to be there except for like 2 rows all in white. I think we're still going to get a great atmosphere for this game.
Yeah, I've been on the field at a lot of games, and whether it's at noon, 3:30, 7:30, once it's loud, it's loud. Now, the difference is the logistics of it, right? When you're in central Pennsylvania, to get to Happy Valley and get there for a new, it doesn't have that all day buildup. And I've been there and it will be loud, but I think the anticipation, the scene, and there's just something when it's dark and the lights come on and the fireworks, it does make it that much more intimidating. So there's no question it'll be loud. And you can say, well, fans, then get there earlier. Well, at what point, it's a noon kickoff. If this is a central time game and you're playing on big noon and it's an 11 a.m. kickoff, at some point, it's just not logistically possible. So I think it's the buildup to it. And then the hour before the game, once the game kicks, the atmosphere is going to be incredible. But it is light out. Like, there's just something to it that makes playing, and I think it, credit ESPN and ABC and probably the NFL for this too. Like, when you play at night on Sunday Night Football or Monday Night Football, or you've played all these years on ABC's primetime night game, that's the stage that these players have grown up watching. Now, if you're an SEC fan, you may say, I don't want to play at night. I want to play at 3:30. I want to hear that song. I want my team on at 3:30. And that's the best time for a college football game. But I think it's been ingrained in us that playing at night is the stage, is the biggest stage. But when the lights are on, it does add a little extra element to it. And no matter what you can say to fans is get there early, tailgate, start your tailgate at 7 a.m. and I'm sure they will. You don't have that build up in the anticipation leading up to it. I think that's the biggest difference.
To go industry here for a second, because I'm curious your thoughts. This is what I don't understand. The Fox noon big kickoff, if you think about it, is a great idea, right? There's not many great noon games. So for them to say, we're going to take over a slot for the most part that's not prioritized by other networks, it is genius. Yeah. With that said, no matter what time Penn State-Ohio State kicks on Saturday, right? That is going to be the most watched game without a doubt. I don't get why you can't make an exception in some cases. We've seen Gus and Joel call not the 12 o'clock game before. We've seen them call a 4 o'clock game, but they did it a few weeks ago. BYU, I think it was Arizona. 4 o'clock game. It was not big noon kickoff.
I'm going to stop you.
7:30.
I'm going to stop you right there. Because the TV deal, there's 2 reasons, right? Number one is the Big Ten has intentionally, and Fox has a stake, a big stake, majority stake in the Big Ten. So they get first priority. Fox is noon, CBS is 3:30, NBC is 7:30. So the Big Ten, with all of these premier programs, can have a premier program in each of its 3 primetime. They have 3 primetime windows. One of them just happens to be at 12 noon. The second element is, if the Los Angeles Dodgers did not take the World Series in 5 games, World Series game number 6 would have taken place on Saturday night.
I think that should have been game 7, which is even probably bigger, which fine. You win. I'm trying here. I'm trying to think of it from a logistical standpoint.
No, I agree with you. I agree. But yeah, you're right. Because Thursday would have been off. So game 7 would have been Saturday night. Game 7 would have been Saturday night.
I get. But I guess you're right. And so let me throw it this way really fast here. This is Big Ten fans should get used to this, is what you're saying.
Yeah.
In terms of maybe their biggest game that you're used to having at night now being at 12.
It's not going away anytime soon.
Not wrong. I mean, again, it's worked for them, and I think you're right about that. And that's one of the I guess, with all the money coming into college football, that is one of the downsides, is that fans do lose in this situation.
It's a money situation. It is a money situation. That college sports are a business. Now, it's been interesting, and I don't want to go too far down this road because I want to get into the game, but it's been interesting to watch ratings. Like, the ratings still are better for prime time games. ESPN has outdrawn, ABC has outdrawn, for the most part, this time slot, with the exception, if you go back the last couple of years, of Ohio State, Michigan, which has been a top 5 game for the last 3-4 seasons. So it's not like this time slot, it's still rating high. It's still rating in the top 5, top 10 every week. But, I think at the end of the year, go back and examine the TV ratings by time slot, by network. And if for some reason that started to change and shift, that's the only way this would. And one last thing. So
you're saying Penn State fans don't watch on Saturday. Ohio State fans don't watch, boycott, drive the ratings down, and maybe they'll be primetime again.
I'm serious. That is the only way for it to change. But something else I read that was really interesting, what made this so appealing to Fox, was with Pennsylvania being a swing state in the election, and Ohio, somewhat, I guess not as much this year, but with this being a swing state in the election, the weekend before Election Day, the ad dollars that come in with a Pennsylvania team playing, with Penn State playing in maybe the swing state for the election, is like, that's a huge business decision for Fox in ad dollars to get this game, to get Penn State before Election Day, the weekend before the election. Speaking of a business, no one may know that more than Ryan Day, the head coach of Ohio State, where, believe it or not, it feels like for him, and maybe for James Franklin and Penn State in some ways as well, like, you can look big picture and say both these teams are still in a great spot for the college football playoff if this game doesn't go their way. And I truly believe that to be accurate. But it feels like for both of these coaches, and maybe both of these programs, they need to win this game. It's not a must win because your season's still plenty alive afterwards, but the stakes of this game are really high for both teams for different reasons, I think.
I totally agree. And that's why, I saw a lot of this on social media, and more from the Penn State perspective, because they're the one right now that's undefeated. This game doesn't really mean much. It's kind of a bonus if you win, but it's not that big of a deal if you lose. And from the college football playoff perspective, technically that is right? If Penn State loses, they are not out of the playoff. They still very much control their destiny. They could probably afford to lose one more game and still would get in at 10-2. So I get the urgency of, unlike previous years, you lose, it's almost no harm, no foul. But I agree with what Jason just talked about before. I think this is a massive game for Penn State. I don't think they can afford to come into this game and say, if we win, great, but if not, oh, well, we'll kind of see how it goes. I think there needs to be a massive sense of urgency. This is a must win, in my opinion, because I think you do have to break through. I think you do have to prove, hey, we are not just, a team that is right now beating up a schedule that maybe is not as challenging as others. We are a real team, and what we have shown is not only that we're a good team, but we're an elite team, and we can beat anyone in the country. I think the first step in doing that, or showing that, I should say, is doing it, is beating Ohio State. I do think you have to win this game if you're the Nittany Lions, if you're a fan, to have true belief this team could win a national title. Could they lose this game and still go on a run? Yes, it's not impossible. But I think in terms of, if you want to look at the national title in a year that's open, and you say, can Penn State have a real opportunity to do this? I think it starts by winning on Saturday. I think this game is really important for Penn State.
I think there are a lot of factors that go into it. The fact that you won't host Ohio State again until 2028 at Beaver Stadium, with Ohio State right now looking the way they looked last week and having the injuries on the offensive line, you feel like it's a pretty even matchup going into the game. And there are some spots where you feel like Penn State truly has the edge, maybe for the first time since 2017, 2018. Against Ohio State in this matchup. Not that they haven't played close games. It was a 20-12 game last year. It could have gone either way in Columbus. But I agree with you that I feel like Penn State's sitting at the same spot Michigan was a couple of years ago, where they're knocking on the door, and I don't think they would say it externally. And I don't know, because James Franklin's messaging is so strong internally. I don't know that it is true, but it feels like not only do they have to prove it to the rest of the country, but it almost feels like, okay, we got to prove it to ourselves here that you belong in that conversation. And I think a win, Jason talked about it, you've talked about it, what this would mean for them moving forward to break through again against an Ohio State. I think it is a huge game for them. I really do. Obviously, the long-term implications of it are important, but I think for the program, James Franklin, after that game in 2018, delivered a speech that has been played back about breaking through and being elite. And he promised to get the program to be elite. This is a year where a much heralded class, Drew Aller, Abdul Carter, Nicholas Singleton, Katron Allen, this is supposed to be the group that does it. Well, here they are in their junior season. The stage is set for them to do it. So I think it is. I think it is a game for them that has a lot of meaning in what they could say to the rest of the college football world and say to themselves as a program.
And I think, too, this game is important because of how Ohio State is looking. Like we talked about on Monday's pod, this feels like the most vulnerable Ohio State team since 2011 when Luke Fickell was the coach and went 6-7. Every matchup Penn State has played Ohio State for the most part. I mean, they've only won one, and they've played them close, but Penn State was, I believe, the underdog in almost every single game that they've played against Ohio State. Ohio State has always been the better team. Penn State could play them close, but it was always like Ohio State clearly is above, then Penn State's below. They are even. I'm with you. I think they come into this game dead even. And so when you have this opportunity right in front of you, I think you have to capitalize. If Ohio State was playing, if they were playing like Oregon was playing, let's just say, they beat the Ducks on the road, they're healthy. I think, you know what, if you play competitive and lose, I think it's a win. But with how they've played recently here, some injuries on the offensive line, they are vulnerable. I think if you're Penn State here, you have to win. I think anything less than a W is a big disappointment.
I think in the moment it is, but also because you still have 1, 2, 3 months of college football left, you certainly could change that narrative. You could as the season went on.
You could,
but
you could.
But in this moment, yes, it is a significant game. What about the Ohio State perspective on that? Like, what does this game mean for them with all that noise about Ryan Day going into this game?
This means everything. Well, I think this game, I think will tell you where Ohio State's season is going. If you can pull yourself up by your bootstraps, kind of like what we saw with Georgia a few weeks ago going into Texas and winning that game and kind of turning their season around. If you can go into Happy Valley on Saturday, win this game, I think we're talking about Ohio State right back in the College World Playoff discussion, maybe as one of, if not the teams to beat here going forward. And I think you feel really good about where the Buckeyes are going into November. If you lose this game trip, I get it. It's the number 3 team in the country on the road, and your second loss would be, again, or both losses would be on the road to top 5 opponents. Nothing to sneeze at. But with where the expectations were before the year of title or bust, best Ohio State roster ever. Joshua Perry just talked about how he thinks this skill group of players could rival and be better than the 2014 team that won a national title. You have all of that collection of talent, and to have 2 losses going into early November, having maybe now you're definitely your Big Ten title hopes dashed. So now you're not looking at a bye. You're probably not looking at a first-round playoff game in the shoe, but now you have to go on the road maybe if you make the playoff here and have to beat Indiana. This is, I think, Ohio State season trip right here on Saturday. If you lose, they can still make the playoff and probably will. But I think when you talk about title contender, cross their name off. This feels like the direction of their season will be determined by what happens on Saturday. What are your thoughts?
There's one thing I object to there, and the thought of if Ohio State loses this game, they still make the playoff, because they'd have so much pressure when they play Indiana. They'd still have to play Michigan this year at the end of the year. I think they lose this game, their playoff. Like, for them to go from national title favorites to being, oh my gosh, look where we're at. We've got to win out to make the playoffs, and the pressure on them the rest of the way. That's why I think this is a massive. They win this, they're great. They're in great shape. But I think it's a massive game for that reason. For let alone all the noise and whatever you want to say about Ryan Day and the pro. There's the injuries will not be an excuse. Like there is no excuse.
Right.
Depth is. There's a couple of things that define national championship teams. Depth might be the top, might be number one. You need to be deep to win in college football. And that's why I think Penn State matches up well this year, because I think they're so deep and so talented. And we've talked about what they lost on the offensive line. Well, even with a guy like Anthony Donko, whose status is unknown for this game, you don't hit the panic button. With Dennis Sutton, who might be a first-round NFL talent, well, if he doesn't play at defensive end, you don't really hit the panic button because Penn State is deep. If Drew Aller, and everything looks like he might play after, the videos that came out of Happy Valley on Wednesday and him at practice and his mobility. Well, if Drew Aller can't go, you don't hit the panic button because Penn State is deep. And that's where James Franklin has built his program to mirror the other teams in the Big Ten. That's, when they were in the team that Jason was on and the 2017, 2018 teams, they were really good, but they weren't as deep. This is a deep, talented 2-3 deep Penn State roster, and depth ultimately defines the teams that are left at the end. Georgia, guy goes out on defense. Next guy's up, probably an NFL talent. Alabama, guy goes out. That doesn't matter. We got another NFL player waiting behind him. Ohio State, all of these years, there's always been next man up, next man up. For whatever reason, right now, particularly on that offensive line, the one spot they could ill afford to lose someone, it is not next man up. And Ryan Day said Zen Mikowski is trending towards not playing in this game. Now, he said they're going to have a good plan, but he said he's trending towards not playing. And that is a huge, huge concern for Ohio State.
And that's what leads to so much disappointment. And I think rightfully so, criticism on Ryan Day, because we saw this Ohio State team a few years ago lose Nick Bosa after 3 games, plug in Chase Young, and go from one top 5 pick to the next.
Great example. Yep.
And it's just you're so used to that for Ohio State. You never worried about depth. And now it's all of a sudden you're like, well, this team is so shallow. It's like, this is a shock. Like, what happened? And that's why I'm with you. Like, if Ryan Day loses this game, Ohio State loses this game, I think the criticism of Ryan Day is fair, because for all the flashy moves you made at quarterback and running back and safety and bringing everyone on defense back, if you couldn't shore up your depth on the offensive line, develop anybody, recruit anybody, that's on you, man. Like you put yourself in a situation where the weakest link could end your season. And for all the expectations, this is a massive game here. And this is a massive game. Like I said, that Indiana game in a few weeks becomes huge for both teams.
Let's get into our picks for this week. We'll obviously start with that game. 4th-ranked Ohio State at 3rd-ranked Penn State. Ohio State 3.5-point favorites. Over-under for this game pretty low, 45.5, 12 noon, Fox Big Noon kickoff, as we've discussed. This is one of only 2 ranked versus ranked matchups in college football this week. The other is undefeated Pittsburgh, probably without its quarterback, 7-0 at 20th-ranked SMU, 7-1. Big game for the Panthers. Big game for SMU as well. That game has a lot at stake. But Penn State, Ohio State, ultimately, we've picked this one apart at every layer and every level. Here's my 2 biggest keys. Obviously, Penn State's defensive line matchup against Ohio State's offensive line. What Ohio State can do to try to get some semblance of a running game going, and what they can do to get Will Howard out of the pocket in the passing game to give him time, because if he sits back there in the pocket, it's not going to go well for them. And what they can do with Will Howard in the running game. Like, to me, that is a huge element of this game. Will Howard, will they unlock him in the running game to create another matchup where Penn State has to account for the quarterback and give Ohio State a number, because it's all about creating numbers and a numbers advantage. That offensive line, defensive line matchup, obviously, is the biggest matchup in this game. But let me take it to the other side. Nebraska ran for 121 yards against Ohio State's defense. Now, it's only 3.7 yards per carry, but it's enough to keep balance. Oregon ran for 155 yards against Ohio State, 5 yards per carry. both teams were also able to create enough explosive plays. Ohio State's defense against Penn State's offense. Penn State needs to be able to run the ball. Solid. Not great, but solid against Ohio State. And Penn State has to create some explosive plays in the passing game. So that's the other thing. Penn State's offense, ability to run and ability to create a few explosive plays. That's outside of the O-line, D-line matchup that we've talked about ad nauseum and it's going to be beaten to death, and rightfully so. That's the other thing to watch for in this game.
Two things I'm watching for here. Ohio State offense versus Penn State defense. The thing that I'm nervous about the most in this perspective trip is Penn State's defensive backs taking on Ohio State's wide receivers. Obviously, the Buckeyes' talent at receiver is tremendous. And we've seen Penn State struggle. Bowling Green, they put up a good amount of yards. Connor Basilik really picked them apart in the first half. We saw Miller Moss, especially when they had balance in the run game as well. That pass game opened up. Trying to cover Jeremiah Smith one-on-one, God bless it. Trying to cover Mecca Buka one-on-one, impossible. If the pressure for Penn State is not getting home, especially in a four-man rush, if Ohio State is doing a good enough job at plugging up their left side of the line and giving Will Howard time, he's going to pick them apart. He is. Now, I think Penn State will get home, but if they don't, Will Howard can have a big day. I think these receivers can have a big day because I don't think Penn State's secondary is right now good enough at this point to lock those guys down and take them out of the game. And on the
if
flip
they
side
do,
here,
let me add one thing there quick, Ryan.
Sure.
If they do get home, I don't envision this being one of those 35-31 type games. Like, this could be a lower scoring game. If they do get home, Will Howard just needs to protect the football because he has an interception in 4 of his last 5 games. One of his problems always has been turnovers. If he protects the football, Penn State's game at Wisconsin turned on a Jalen Reed pick 6, and he had 2 interceptions in that game. One they didn't call an interception on the field, but it was. He's playing at an elite level right now in that Penn State secondary. A.J. Harris and Jalen Kimber have been pretty good at cornerback for him as well. But Will Howard has to protect the football. If you don't make the major mistake, kind of the way Penn State last year, they didn't play well in Columbus, but Drew Aller never made the big mistake. So even though it didn't look pretty, they were still in it until the end. You can't make the big mistake. You'll have a chance in this game. It will still be a tight game no matter what.
And I think for Penn State offensively, right, I think one of the X factors, obviously everyone's talking about Tyler Warren. I think Nick Singleton in the passing game here, what he's shown the last few weeks, having the game-tying touchdown reception at USC, a one-handed incredible touchdown reception in the back of the end zone against Wisconsin last week. He has been a real threat in the pass game here. And we talked about Joshua Perry. I do think the Ohio State DBs have an advantage over Penn State's wide receivers. I think Penn State has talent, but they've just not been consistent enough in terms of getting open, catching the ball. Julian Fleming's had some drops, some big-time drops. He's made some big catches, but also has been a little inconsistent in terms of catching the football. We've seen Amari Evans and Harrison Wallace appear and look great, and they disappear and can't find them. Nick Singleton, I think in the passing game here, how he matches up against Ohio State's safeties or linebackers, I think is going to have a big factor in this game because he is, when he's healthy and going, he is one of the most unstoppable players. Like, you put him in space, he's gone. He can outrun you. He can run you over. He's tremendous. I'm really excited to see. I think you can get 3-4 catches here. I think you can break up a big one here. That's the matchup on offense I'm looking at here. I think that could really help change the game and be a big-time difference maker. With that said, I agree with you. Lower scoring game. I think Penn State wins 27-23. Goes over the over, but still I think it's on the lower side here of scoring. I think Penn State makes enough plays. Their offense is, I think, truly creative and explosive enough this year compared to previous years to get some yards, get some points on Ohio State's defense that they've struggled at in recent years. Give me the Penn State at home. I think they break through here, get a big win at home, take down Ohio State 27-23.
It's so funny you mentioned Fleming, obviously, because of his history playing a Pennsylvania guy who left to play at Ohio State for all those years, then comes back to Penn State. I think he has a big play in this game against his former team. It's hard to pick Penn State because Ohio State, until you prove otherwise, right? Penn State's knocked on the door, and they haven't kicked the door down. I like your score, and I like Penn State in this game at home. I think the matchups favor them. I think Andy Kotelnicki's a difference maker. I think Drew Aller plays well enough. I think Bo Pribula has a role in this game. I think everything being at home is pointing towards Penn State breaking through against Ohio State. Feels like a big one. It feels like a big one here in Happy Valley, and I think they get it done.
How about Minnesota at number 24, Illinois? Like you said, how about this line? Minnesota on the road. 3-point favorites in Champaign. Noon kick as well on FS1. Is it your antennas up here in Vegas? Are you kind of buying what they're feeding you?
Well, for Minnesota to do this, they would have to do something that the program never has done, and that's beat Brett Bielema for the first time in program history. He's 10-0 all-time against Minnesota. That includes being 3-0 while at Illinois. The Gophers are hot. They've looked good. Their running game has been a nice compliment to Max Brosmer coming off his best game as a Golden Gopher. In all three of the Gophers' losses, they have not they have not reached the 100-yard mark with their rushing game. If they can run the ball and create a couple of turnovers on defense, Illinois' problem in their losses, there's a couple, but Luke Altmaier has turned the ball over. Illinois is banged up right now. If Minnesota's defense, with those 15 picks they have this year, can create interceptions against Altmaier, who hasn't thrown a pick in a win this year, but has thrown picks in their 2 losses, they say they're healthier. Well, it remains to be seen. Pat Bryant, Torrey Cox at cornerback, defensive backs, Brooks, Patterson, they're banged up. So I think everything trends towards Minnesota. If they can get their run game going, get some turnovers on defense, I think it trends towards Minnesota winning this game on the road. And I think because of the injuries as well, that leads to that line being the Golden Gophers, being them favorites on the road.
I get Illinois coming in, right, kind of limping after that blowout loss to Oregon. I think Illinois wins this game. I think it's a lower scoring game. I think 21-17. They do win and pull off the Vegas upset here at home because while they are banged up, and while they're not playing their best football right now, what I do like and trust about this team led by Brett Bielema is the fact that they can win in different ways. They can win by airing the ball out. They can win by running the football. They can win with low scoring offense and a great defense. They can win with their defense getting no stops and their offense scoring 50 points against Purdue. I like the fact that they don't have just one style in which they rely on to win. I think that gives them flexibility to where your point about the injuries are real and it is a concern. But I think worst case, if you do miss Pat Bryant, you can still, I think, run the ball, have success, and have Luke Altmaier still play well in this match without one of his key receivers. I just think right now, Illinois, I think they're tough. I think they're real. I think they're talented. I think they're balanced. So even though injuries are not there in their favor, even though they're coming off that bad loss to Oregon, I think they win. I think they win at home again. 21-17, lower scoring game. But I trust right now Illinois in a close, tight game more than I trust Minnesota.
Next game, Northwestern at Purdue. Northwestern, 1-point favorites on the road, 12 o'clock on BTN. Purdue allowing 38 points per game this year. I thought, I'm going to pick Northwestern. Their defense has been a little bit better. Northwestern has allowed 63 points in their last 2 games, 2 straight losses after their 37-10 win at Maryland. And remember in that win at Maryland, I don't even know that they had 10 first downs on offense. Maryland just turned the ball over in that game. I'm going to take Purdue because they're at home. I don't really have much more to say about this game.
I like Northwestern to bounce back here. They've been tough. I know the offense has really been bogged down, but I think their defense does cause turnovers. I think they do win on the road. Give me a lower 24-20. 24-20, Northwestern takes down Purdue. They do get the victory. Number 1 team in the country, Trip, Oregon on the road at the Big House, where they are 15-point favorites over the Wolverines. Davis Warren getting his 2nd consecutive start now for Michigan. Looked better in probably his best career game last week against Spartans. Does that translate? Can we get a competitive game in the Big House, or does Oregon keep on rolling?
Oregon, now that they have the rushing game going, 176 rush yards per game. Michigan, you talked about secondary being a little bit banged up. I don't see how you slow down the Ducks in this one. The only hiccup potentially for Oregon is if Michigan does not turn the ball over and can shorten the game. But if they shorten the game, the only thing in jeopardy is that 2-touchdown spread. There's no chance Oregon goes on the road to the Big House and loses. They are too dynamic and playing too well right now.
I agree. And kind of tell which they're playing well-rounded football. Again, they can pass the ball really well. They're running the ball really well. 3rd in the conference in terms of rushing yards per game in conference play. So they are very balanced. That defense gets better each and every week.
Yep.
The one thing I'll say is obviously sad to see, right, with Jack Tuttle unfortunately announcing this week that he's retiring with another concussion. Obviously, you hate to see a player's career ripped away from him because of injuries. So obviously all the best to Jack Tuttle. But at least with how Michigan, I liked how they handled the quarterback dynamic last week, where Davis Warren played a majority of the snaps. And I thought you worked in Alex Orji perfectly. I don't think it's a coincidence that he had his best career game in terms of rushing the ball, breaking off some big runs. I expect that to happen again this week. But I'm with you. Oregon's rolling right now. They're too good. They're fast. They're physical on defense. Even if Michigan can move the ball a little bit, I can't see them putting up 21 points. And I think you're going to need bare minimum probably 30 here to beat Oregon.
Yeah, I don't think there's it's just a bad matchup for Michigan too. Can they run against Oregon's defensive front? It is a bad matchup. Michigan State at home, probably licking their chops to get another shot here at a good team in 13th ranked Indiana. Michigan State gave opportunities away last weekend in the Big House. Probably should have won that game against Michigan. I think there's some dangerous elements to Michigan State's team right now. What they're doing offensively, I think they've been better than expected defensively. Curtis Rourke is on track to start, though, for Indiana. So you've got a buzzsaw coming into East Lansing. Indiana, more than the health of the quarterback, that's the question. You just had the two biggest weekends in your program's history, at least dating back to the 1960s, playing at the Rock in Bloomington. Now you go on the road. Can you match that in East Lansing against Michigan State? I think they do. I think Kurt Cignetti has them rolling. I think Indiana wins this one and wins it pretty big.
I'm nervous about this game. I think if you look at Indiana's schedule the rest of the way here, obviously the number one game you're most likely to lose is Ohio State. I think Michigan State is number two. I am nervous about this game for the Hoosiers. Like you said, 2 straight big weeks on campus. Now you're going on the road. The atmosphere won't be as hostile. Aiden Childs was playing some really or better football, I should say. He's actually taking care of the ball. He's completing 75% of his passes for 445 yards the last 2 games, 2 touchdowns, 1 pick. So he's at least making sure, and he's doing a good job of cutting down on those turnovers. I think Indiana wins. Now, they've won every game by at least 14 points. And we talked about this on Monday, the first team since 1998 to never trail through the first 8 games of the season. I think they trail. I think this is the first game where they find themselves. Now, it could be 3-0, could be 7-3 early in the game. I think that they find themselves behind at some point this game. I think they do win. The spread is 8. I think they cover the spread, pull away late. But I think this is one of those games in the fourth quarter you're trying to find where the hell is Peacock? Am I subscribed or not to get to this game here? Because I think it will be close late. Give me Indiana pulling away 31-23. So it's right on the number there of 8. I think, though, this is a close game, but I think Indiana does prevail.
UCLA at Nebraska, 3:30 Big Ten Network. Nebraska about a 7-point favorite, 6.5-point favorites. Low scoring projection. Over-under is under 40 points for this game. I think Nebraska builds off of what happened last weekend in Columbus. Dylan Raiola, big game for Nebraska here. Get back on track. I think they build off of what happened last weekend in Columbus. They've got a good defense. I don't think UCLA is able to score enough in this game on the road in what should be a pretty good atmosphere still in Lincoln. I like Nebraska.
I'm calling this trip, I'm curious your thoughts, a maturity game for the Cornhuskers. They've had some rough games here where they got blown up by Indiana, played better against Ohio State, but still obviously did not come away with the win. You look at how Dylan Raiola has played the last 3 games. He's really hit the freshman wall. 5 interceptions, just 173 passing yards on average in those 3 games. Now you're facing the second worst pass defense in the conference in UCLA. You're at home. You should win. You should cover this touchdown spread. You should handle this game. And I think it's going to be a test of maturity of when you've now, fallen short and the season kind of has come off the rails after a promising September. How do you respond in games like this? I think Nebraska does respond well, but I think it will be telling here if we're talking about a close game or maybe even a UCLA upset. I think it does kind of show the maturity and the leadership of this team going forward here, depending on how they play. How about 7:30 NBC Eastern, Wisconsin at Iowa? Quarterback change here, Trip. Iowa has, Cade McNamara's in the concussion protocol. So Brendan Sullivan here will make the start for the Hawkeyes. I don't know if you saw this last week. This was hilarious. I've never seen this before. Brendan Sullivan completed a pass. Now it was only 5 yards on the field, but completed the pass, then ran ahead of his receiver to deliver a block like 25 yards down the field. You saw how that fired up the Hawkeyes. You see how the players have talked about Brendan Sullivan's impact and energy throughout the week. There seems to be a real rally now around their new quarterback. I think they have an energized game. I think they come out here, play really well against Wisconsin. I think they score some points. I think this may be, maybe not in terms of total, like we saw them put 40 against Washington a few weeks ago, so maybe not a season high in terms of total points, but I think that they have their cleanest, most efficient offensive game here. I think they win. I think they win pretty handily.
Yeah, and I think their defense can create some turnovers against Wisconsin as well, especially with this game being in Iowa City. Iowa's played really well at home. It's kind of a theme in the Big Ten. Teams have played really well at home and have struggled when they go on the road. Wisconsin, talk about, had Penn State last weekend. Now you're at Iowa, toughest place to play in the Big Ten. Night game in Iowa City is no joke. Then you have Oregon, then at Nebraska, and then Minnesota. Tough game for the Badgers. I like Iowa in this game for a lot of the reasons you pointed out.
And finally, speaking of road woes, USC at Washington. Both teams in the Big Ten winless on the road, 7:30 Eastern kick, 4:30 local time on Big Ten Network trip. Does USC break the trend? Do they get a road victory here in the Big Ten?
I want to talk about that a little bit more too. Like, you've had USC, they lost at Michigan, lost at Minnesota, lost at Maryland, Washington, lost at Rutgers, at Iowa, and at Indiana. Is this a trend? UCLA played okay in Happy Valley. They did win at Rutgers, but Oregon, different story. They're elite, but we'll see what happens this weekend in Ann Arbor. But we've talked all about the records of the teams from the East going to the West and having struggled. For these West Coast teams to make those long trips every single week, do we have it's worth watching. Do we have a trend developing here that USC's got a decent team but can't win on the road? Washington's got a decent team but can't win on the road? Playing in those Big Ten stadiums? I think we might have an actual trend developing here.
I would agree with that. And I think the trend I don't think it's a long lasting trend, I'll say, but because this is the first year in the Big Ten, everyone's trying to figure out logistics, right? No one in Columbus has ever really had to think about how do we fly to Eugene and how do we do that before, right? Michigan, same thing going to Washington, or Penn State going to USC. Like, these logistics for the most part for these teams are very new or very rare. I think you'll have a home field advantage for maybe the first 2 or 3 years, but you see it in the NFL. I know it's a little different because they have bigger airports and it's getting in and out of bigger cities is easier. I get that compared to some of these smaller remote campuses. But I think once you kind of do it once or twice and kind of get a feel, this is what works best for us. We go out early. Kirk Cincinnati wants to get there as late as possible. James Franklin and Penn State got out there as early as possible. You'll find what works for certain teams. And I think you'll start to see a balance come back to where it's not so lopsided in basically terms of the home team when it's an extreme travel, winning most of the time. But for right now, the first 2, maybe 3 years until I think everyone makes one trip around the Big Ten, I think it will be a big factor and a big concern.
The weather hasn't even changed it. And I just think there's something unique, and the crowds and the tradition, the history, the style of play, even though it's evolved, as I said earlier in the podcast, there's something unique about going to an Iowa City. There's something about going to even West Lafayette, Indiana, or going to Minneapolis to play the Gophers, or going to Lincoln to play Nebraska, that I don't know that you get, and maybe this is me being naive, that you get when you go to Tucson, that you get when you go to play in Tempe against Arizona State. I think there's something unique about the Big Ten, and I think these programs will have to adapt to that. I can't put my finger on exactly what it is, but I think this is a real challenge for teams going across the West Coast, the new teams going to Big Ten venues. Obviously, that's not a factor here. USC at Washington, a traditional Pac-12, Pac-10 matchup. Washington, number 1 ranked pass defense in yards allowed, number 6 in total defense. They're playing at home against USC. I like Washington because of the matchup, and I don't know. Like, this is a coin flip game. Just give me Washington. Just give me Washington because they're at home.
I trust them more. I trust them. I know that, again, their record would say otherwise, and some of the losses would say otherwise. Like, that
they're
defense
tougher.
is good. They are tougher. And Will Rogers can sling it. Like, that offense could put up some points here. I trust, right? I mean, crazy to say this. I trust Washington and Jed Fish right now in a closer game more than I trust Lincoln Riley and USC. The track record for the Trojans this year gives you no reason to believe they can pull out a close game, especially, I think, on the road. So give me Washington. I think they win by a touchdown. I'm going to say 27-20. They beat the Trojans. But, yeah, I think they win at home. And, again, it's not exactly cross country, just going up north if you're USC. But I think the home teams continue to dominate here in the Big Ten. That's it, Trip. This has been a fun podcast. I know we went a little long here, But
Yeah.
I thought it was really good information there. I think a lot of fun. I think sets up for a big weekend, highlighted by Penn State-Ohio State here, as we kick off the home stretch and get set for what should be a chaotic but exciting November.
And now I've earned one of those Reese's peanut butter pumpkins because there's nothing quite like it. It's because the balance of the peanut butter and then chocolate. I've earned that here on this Halloween episode.
Last question, really fast. Is that the number one Halloween candy?
Yeah, that hands down. Reese's pumpkins.
I'll go Reese's cup. I won't specify in terms of shape, but Reese's. There's nothing.
No, there's
Chocolate,
something more
nothing.
about the proportion of. There's something about the proportion of chocolate to peanut butter in the pumpkins, the eggs, the hearts. There's something about that. It's just a little bit different that makes them a little bit more special.
I love the ridges though. The ridges around the end, a little extra crunch, I think make a difference in the peanut butter cups.
There is no way anyone is still listening to this podcast.
So on that note, enjoy Halloween. As you can see, we dressed up here for the occasion. Enjoy the games on Saturday. We'll be back on Monday to wrap it all up right here on the Still Enrolled podcast.